I can still see the station platform in my mind, though most of the city around it has been torn down and replaced by cleaner things. Back then, it looked stained by departures. The paint on the benches had chipped down to gray metal. A clock hung over the ticket window, with one hand always a little behind. I was 23, standing there with one small suitcase and a train ticket in my shirt pocket. And I remember thinking that my whole life has somehow been packed into a bag that would not even close properly. Chicago was printed on the ticket in blue ink. There was an electrical apprenticeship there my uncle had pushed me to apply for. He said I had good hands and more nerve than I believed. He said, "Go now, before you build a life around staying." At 23, I took that sentence as an insult. I thought staying meant loyalty. I thought leaving was for men who did not know how to appreciate what they already had. That is the noble lie fear tells when it wants to dress itself as maturity. I did not know that then. I only knew my chest tightened every time I pictured stepping off a train into a city where nobody knew my name, where I could fail in public, where the version of me I had leaned on all my life would no longer be enough. My mother cried the night before, though she tried to hide it, not because she wanted me to stay, but because she knew exactly what was happening. She folded my shirts and kept saying practical things about weather, money, meals on the train. My father said almost nothing. He stood in the doorway chewing a toothpick and told me to call when I got there. Looking back, both of them were watching the same contest. Opportunity on one side, fear on the other. And because fear was wearing the face of common sense, it had an unfair advantage. The train had not yet arrived when I pulled a ticket from my pocket and read it again. Chicago, departure 8:40, coach 3. I can still remember the tiny tearing sound when I bent the paper. It was not dramatic. That is what still gets me. My life did not change in some thunderclap. It changed in a quiet, stupid gesture made by a young man who wanted immediate relief more than long-term truth. I tore the ticket once, then twice, and dropped the pieces into a trash can beside the bench. When I walked back home with that suitcase bumping against my leg, I told myself I had made the responsible choice. The city was expensive. The risk was high. I could work another year and try later. Later is a liar that always speaks in a calm voice. By the time I reached our block, I had nearly convinced myself that I was wise. I did not understand that some doors are not really doors at all. They are moments, and they stay open only while you are brave enough to move. The next morning I woke with the sour feeling of a man pretending not to remember what he had done. Shame does not always arrive as tears. Sometimes it comes dressed as routine. I shaved. I buttoned the same work shirt. I walked back to the filling station as if nothing had happened. My boss, Earl, nodded at me from under the hood of a truck and tossed me a rag. By lunch, I had grease under my nails and the beginning of a story I would repeat for years. Chicago fell through. The timing was bad. Maybe next year. It sounded sensible enough that people accepted it without asking much more. That was the first reward fear gave me after I obeyed it. Immediate social comfort. A month later, Earl told me a hardware distributor outside town needed another stock clerk and shipping hand. Better pay, steadier hours, no travel, no training period in another city. Everything about it was smaller, safer, closer. I said yes within a day. That should have told me something. I had spent weeks paralyzed over the chance to become something larger than I was, and 24 hours embracing a job designed so I would never have to test myself. But when you are young and scared, the thing that calms your nerves looks a lot like the thing meant for you. The warehouse sat on the edge of town beside a rail spur and a weed lot full of broken pallets. Inside it smelled like rope, paint thinner, and wet cardboard. The work was not terrible. That is the tragedy. If it had been brutal from the start, I might have rebelled. Instead, it was manageable. It paid enough for gas, dinners out, and the illusion of progress. I learned inventory codes, loading schedules, vendor names. Older men slapped my shoulder and told me I had a solid future there. Solid was the word everyone used when they wanted to praise a life with no expansion in it. At first, I told myself the warehouse was temporary. I would save money, reapply somewhere bigger, take classes at night. But the heart is lazy in dangerous ways. It can get used to the shape of a room and the exact amount of disappointment required to function. After 6 months, I knew where every aisle ended. After a year, I stopped mentioning Chicago. Around that time, I met Ellen at a church picnic under a canvas tent in June. She laughed with her whole face and asked questions nobody else asked. What did I want out of life? Where would I live if money did not matter? Was this town home, or merely where I happened to be standing? I answered carefully. I had already begun curating myself into someone who sounded reliable instead of honest. What I did not understand then was how quickly a temporary shelter can become a permanent address for the soul. Once a decision gives you relief, your mind starts defending it as character. That is how small choices harden into identity. We married in October in a church that smelled faintly of floor polish and old hymnals. It was a good day. I do not cheapen that now just because I know what came after. Ellen looked calm and luminous in a way I still have trouble describing without feeling the old ache rise in my throat. Everyone said we were well matched, sensible, steady, built to last. Again, that word, built, as if a life could be assembled out of caution alone. Our first apartment sat above a barber shop downtown. The windows rattled when trucks passed. The kitchen was narrow enough that 2 people could not cross without touching. We were happy there for a while. And maybe that is why I let the next drift happen. Happiness, when it comes at the wrong altitude, can make you protect what is comfortable more fiercely than what is true. Ellen would sit at the table in the evenings with a school catalog or one of her library books, and she would talk about places we could go. Not fancy places, just different places. She had an aunt in Milwaukee who said schools were hiring. She knew of a program in St. Louis that offered evening certifications. There was a cousin in Denver who swore the city was full of people starting over. Ellen did not speak from fantasy. She spoke from motion. She believed life was something you answered. Every time she raised the possibility of leaving, I became the voice of prudent delay. We need more savings. Let us wait until the lease ends. Let us get through winter. It is amazing how respectable cowardice sounds when you phrase it as timing. I was not protecting us. I was protecting myself from the humiliation of change. If we moved and I failed, I could no longer blame the limits of the town. I would have to confront the limits I had quietly accepted in myself. One rainy night, maybe 2 years into the marriage, Ellen stood at the sink drying plates while I sat at the table with a checkbook open. She said, not loudly, "If we do not leave soon, I think we never will." I knew she was right. That was the worst part. I started listing costs and risks. Rent elsewhere. No guarantee of work. No support system. I spoke in figures because figures sound irrefutable. But underneath each number was the same old fear that had made me tear up that train ticket. Ellen turned from the sink with the dish towel in her hands and looked at me in a way no one ever had. Not angry, just suddenly clear. She said, "You keep calling it wisdom, but it feels like fear in every room we live in." I laughed then, lightly, the way weak men laugh when a truth lands too close. I told her adulthood meant compromise. She went quiet after that, and although the marriage did not end that night, something essential stopped moving between us. The years that followed did not feel like a collapse. They felt like sediment settling. A modest house on Maple Street, a second-hand dining table, utility bills folded under a magnet on the refrigerator, a promotion from stock clerk to shift supervisor, then later warehouse manager. The kind of life people point to when they want to praise dependability. I wore that praise like a medal because I did not know what else to do with the part of me that still flinched whenever I passed the train station or saw an out-of-state license plate at a gas pump. We had 2 children, Laura first and then Ben 3 years later. They saved parts of me I might otherwise have let harden completely. Holding them as babies, walking them feverish at night, hearing them laugh in the yard on summer evenings, those things were not false. They were the truest things in my life. I need to say that plainly, because regret can become dishonest if it starts erasing what was beautiful. I loved my family deeply. The problem is that love does not excuse the atmosphere you build around the people who depend on you. I built an atmosphere of caution. I called it responsibility. We bought sensible clothes, took sensible vacations, said no to anything that smelled of unnecessary risk. When Laura wanted to audition for a summer arts program in another state, I asked whether that path was realistic. When Ben talked about taking a gap year to travel before college, I warned him about wasting momentum. I thought I was teaching prudence. What I was really doing was passing down my private religion. Do not reach too far, because disappointment is survivable, but exposure is not. Ellen saw it long before I did. Sometimes she would look at me after I dismissed one of the children's big ideas and say nothing at all. That silence became harder to bear than any argument. It implied a verdict. He is doing to them what he did to himself. By my mid-40s, the life I once called temporary had become architecture. Every choice reinforced the last one. We knew our grocery clerk by name. We knew which floorboard squeaked on the back stairs. I knew exactly how much ambition I could tolerate in other people before it made me uncomfortable. That may be the most humiliating sentence I can write now. I had become a man who found other people's courage vaguely impolite. And yet, in quiet moments, usually late at night, I still felt the old ache. I would sit on the edge of the bed after Ellen had fallen asleep and try to imagine the other version of my life. Not a glamorous one, just one in which I had once chosen enlargement over safety and discovered I could survive it. I never stayed with that thought long. I would get up, turn off the light, and go to work in the morning, briefly touching the truth, then retreating before it changed me. That was my specialty. The first crack wide enough to matter came through Laura. She was 21 and had been accepted into a graduate program in Oregon for environmental design. She came home with a letter in her hand, and her whole body seemed lit from inside. Ellen cried when she read it. Ben whistled and slapped the table. I felt pride immediately, but braided through it came something uglier and more familiar, dread disguised as analysis. By dinner, I was asking about cost of living, housing, debt load, job placement, distance from home, and whether her advisor might be overselling the value of the program. None of these questions were foolish on their own. That's how fear survives inspection. It hides inside reasonable concerns and multiplies them until possibility suffocates under the weight of caution. Laura listened longer than she should have. Then she set her fork down and said, "Dad, do you ever hear yourself when someone wants something?" The room went dead quiet. I tried to recover with a joke, but she did not let me. She said, "It's like you think wanting more is embarrassing." I remember Ellen looking at me then, not triumphant, not angry, just tired, in a way that told me this had been visible to everyone but me for years. I said I was only trying to help her think through the decision. Laura shook her head. "No, you're trying to make the decision feel smaller, so you don't have to watch me take it." I wish I could tell you that I transformed right there. I did not. My first reaction was fury, not because she was wrong, but because she had named the machinery I depended on. I stood up so fast my chair scraped hard against the floor. I told her she was being disrespectful. I told her adulthood required realism. She left the room in tears. Ellen did not follow her. She stayed seated and said very softly, "There it is again." That night I walked the hallway and kept hearing Laura's sentence. "Do you ever hear yourself when someone wants something?" Underneath it was another question I had avoided my whole life. What had I wanted, truly wanted, and what had I done with it? I had convinced myself that maturity meant narrowing, that love meant minimizing risk for everyone around me. But what if I had merely built a household around my own unfinished fear? A week later, Laura told us she was going anyway. She did not ask for permission. She told us. I drove her to the airport because Ellen had work that morning. At the curb, she hugged me and said, "You can still change, Dad." Then she picked up her bag and walked inside without looking back. Driving home alone, I felt not noble, not wise, not steady, just suddenly exposed. At the curb of that airport, watching automatic doors swallow my daughter, I understood something humiliating. I had spent decades confusing love with containment. She was not betraying me by leaving. She was refusing the inheritance I had tried to hand down. Ellen and I began speaking more honestly after Laura left, though honesty at that age has a different flavor than youthful confession. It arrives slower. It has fewer fireworks and more ash. We would sit on the back porch in the evenings after dinner, cicadas grinding in the trees, and talk about the years the way people examine storm damage in daylight. Not accusing, not excusing, just naming what had cracked and what had held. One night, Ellen said, "I don't think you ever trusted life unless it was already familiar." It hurt to hear because it was exact. I told her about the train ticket. She knew, of course, that I had not gone to Chicago, but I had never told her about tearing it up at the station. She listened while I described the bench, the clock, the trash can, the walk home, the story I told myself afterward. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You made one frightened choice, and then spent 30 years organizing the evidence around it." I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. Once I decided I was the kind of man who stayed, every later decision had to support that identity. Otherwise, I would have had to confront that the first choice was not fate. It was fear. People talk about destiny because it sounds cleaner than habit. But habit is what really builds a life. Not the grand beliefs we claim publicly, but the private patterns we keep rewarding. Around my 55th birthday, the warehouse was sold to a regional chain. New managers came in with polite voices and sharp haircuts. They praised my service and phased me out within a year. A severance package, a plaque, a sheet cake in the break room. Men shook my hand and told me I had earned some rest. I drove home that afternoon carrying a cardboard box with a desk clock, 3 pens, and a framed photo of Ellen and the kids at the lake. The world did not end. That was instructive in itself. I had built my identity around avoiding instability. And then instability arrived anyway, casual as weather. Retirement stripped away a set of excuses I had relied on for decades. Without the warehouse and the role of provider absorbing every ounce of self-justification, I could hear the emptier rooms inside me more clearly. I started waking before dawn and sitting in the kitchen with coffee, listening to the refrigerator hum. That is when regret gets loud. But regret, I learned, is not only punishment. Sometimes it is instruction arriving late. I began noticing small things I had never allowed myself to entertain. A continuing education catalog at the library. Volunteer work restoring old homes. A bus trip Ellen suggested we take just because neither of us had been. The old resistance still rose each time. Why bother now? Too late. Too expensive. Too far. But now at least, I recognized the voice. The trip to Oregon happened when I was 61. That may sound minor to a younger person, just a flight and a week away. But for me it felt like stepping into a life-sized confession. Airport still tightened my chest. Unknown streets still made me feel as though I had forgotten something essential. Yet when the plane lifted and the city beneath us flattened into geometry, I felt another sensation rising through the fear. Grief, yes, but also a strange opening. I had denied myself this feeling for 40 years. Not flying, specifically. Expansion. Laura's apartment overlooked a river path lined with cottonwoods. She walked us through neighborhoods full of brick storefronts, bicycles, coffee shops, and people who seemed unembarrassed by reinvention. Nothing there was magical. That was important for me to understand. I had spent decades turning the unlived life into a myth, either glamorizing it so I could resent it, or dismissing it so I could avoid it. Oregon was just a place. Different, yes. Broader, yes. But inhabited by ordinary people who had simply tolerated the discomfort of becoming. On the third day, Laura took me to a community workshop where volunteers were rehabbing old duplexes for low-income families. I stood in a room with stripped studs and paint dust in the air and watched men younger than my sons and women older than Ellen laughing while they measured trim and argued about outlet placement. Someone handed me a pry bar. I instinctively almost refused. Then I caught myself. I spent the afternoon pulling warped baseboards with a retired carpenter named Miguel. He had been an insurance adjuster for 30 years. At 58, he got tired of hearing himself explain why he would do what he loved after things slowed down. So he quit and learned restoration. On the flight home, I told Ellen I kept thinking about how ordinary courage looked from the outside. Not cinematic, not loud, just people making moves before they felt fully protected. She leaned her head back and said, "I've been trying to tell you that since the apartment above the barber shop." I did not become a different man overnight after Oregon. Deep habits loosened slowly. But something had shifted. I began volunteering with a local housing repair nonprofit twice a week, then 3 times. I took a course on residential wiring at the community college, sitting in a classroom with men and women young enough to be my grandchildren. The first night I almost walked out before class began. Instead, I stayed. The one thing I would change, if someone handed me the impossible gift of starting over, is not a city or title or a bank balance. I would change my first agreement with fear. I would refuse to let one frightened decision become my identity. That change did not erase the lost years, but it did expose the lie I had lived by. Courage was never reserved for the naturally bold. It belonged to whoever was willing to move before comfort granted permission. Now I am an old man, and old age has a way of stripping language down till only the durable words remain. We say less because we finally understand how much of what we said before was camouflage. When younger people ask me what I regret, they usually expect a single dramatic mistake. I understand why. Big stories are easier to respect, but my deepest regret is quieter than that. I regret how often I mistook fear for wisdom and then demanded that everyone else respect the costume. I see the pattern clearly now. A torn train ticket, a safe warehouse job, a wife's honest invitation answered with caution, children taught to shrink their own horizon for the sake of security, decades spent decorating a cage and congratulating myself on how sturdy it was. The pain in admitting that is sharp, but there is mercy and clarity. Once you know what ruled you, you can at least stop calling it by the wrong name. Ellen and I are gentler with each other now. We sit in the yard at dusk and talk about trips we still want to take while our knees will carry us. Montreal did happen. So did Santa Fe. Last spring, we rented a little place on the coast for a week, and I woke each morning to gulls and fog and the humiliating realization that I could have lived many lives inside this one if I had not demanded certainty before motion. Ellen does not rub that in. She never has. That is one of the reasons I loved her, even when I was too defended to love her well. Ben teaches history now. Laura runs projects all over the Northwest and sends us photos from job sites that would once have made my stomach twist. Now they make me smile with a mixture of pride and apology. Not apology spoken aloud every time. That would only become another performance. I mean the quieter apology of making room where I once blocked it, of blessing movement where I once tried to fence it in. I still feel fear. Anyone telling you that age erases it is selling comfort. Fear is old machinery. It hums in the walls even after you know where the switch is. The difference now is that I no longer confuse hearing it with obeying it. I can feel the tightening in my chest and still say yes. I can step into a room where I am inexperienced and let myself be a beginner. If I could begin again, I would not ask for a grander life. I would ask for a braver first answer. I would tell the young man at the station that relief is not the same as peace, that staying is not the same as loyalty. That caution becomes cruelty when it starts deciding other people's futures too. I would tell him to keep the ticket intact, even if his hands shake. Since I cannot go back, I do what is still available. I tell the truth now. The one thing I would change is the authority I gave fear at the beginning. Everything else grew from that root. That was the cost. Not because fear visited me, but because I made it chairman of the board